Hello, my name is Paxton Hicks, and I am a master's student here at Oakland University for the Social Psychology program. And here I am presenting to you today a publication that I had the privilege of working on with some collaborators, Dr. Zeigler-Hill and Dr. Avi Besser. And the title of this presentation is Unequal Partners, Uneasy Hearts, Mate Value Discrepancies, and Jealousy. First, let's get into some terms so that we can kind of be on the same page about what we're talking about here. Mate value is the general desirability of a mating partner. So this could be physical attractiveness, mental attractiveness, or resources. Another kind of colloquial way to think about this is, that game that people play where it's like rate yourself 1 through 10. That's kind of what mate value is, but a little bit more scientific. Higher mate value is related to higher standards. So if an individual rates themselves higher, like being a 10, then they may want an individual who is of that higher, mate value. If you're the best, then you're only going to take the best, right? We want valuable individuals. Individuals are kind of seeking people who are more physically attractive or has a mental attractiveness to being intelligent or funny or emotional, things like that. Having the resources too is also a plus. So having money or having a nice house, a nice car, things like that, people value those things. So we want individuals who have more value because they bring more value to the table and assuming like the relationship. Assortative mating is this idea that individuals with the highest mate value have the most picking power. So if you're more physically attractive or you're more mentally attractive or things like that, you might have more of a say in who you're with and what their mate value is comparatively to an individual who might be of lower mate value. Now, there is a general tendency for people to have similar levels of mate value. So on average, a person who is highly attractive might have a highly attractive partner. And this might be like somebody who's smart may have a smart partner, or somebody who is more well off or has more resources might be with someone who also has equally high resources. But exceptions do occur. We're people. Sometimes we look past certain things and we get with people that it may not seem like a fit. So in those cases, low mate value partners may be protective of their mate. So if I have a lower mate value and my partner is very attractive or has a lot of resources, I may want to hold on to them or be more protective of them because I know the value that they bring. And higher mate value partners may question the nature of the discrepant relationship. What that means is that if I'm a higher mate value than my partner, then I may question what their motivations are. Do they really like me for me, or are they just getting something out of it because I have that higher mate value status? So discrepant relationships relate to things like dissatisfaction in the relationship and also attention to alternatives, and they can affect maintenance behaviors within the relationship. So it's important to consider, how does mate values and their discrepancies within a relationship affect other outcomes? One outcome of note might be jealousy. Jealousy is an emotional response to relationship threats. So, mate value discrepancies can relate to higher rates of jealousy. So, for example, a low value partner may express or experience insecurities leading to retention behaviors. Retention behaviors being such as like lashing out or trying to keep the partner, things like that. Jealousy is multifaceted, meaning that jealousy can be described in multiple different ways. So, jealousy can be suspicious, meaning that when there's no tangible threats present, they may still feel feelings of jealousy. So, for example, it's speculative. It's reactions to ambiguous threats, driven by insecurity, fear, distrust, and it can be unhealthy to have these suspicious types of jealousy. There's also reactive jealousy. Reactive can be responding to clear, unambiguous threats. So, for example, if somebody were to put their hand on your partner, like on their shoulder or something like that, or kind of grabbing them in a way, that might be a clear indication or threat which makes someone want to react or respond. The suspicious jealousy might be more like your partner has a female coworker and you're acting on that alone without any actual credible threat, such as them flirting or complimenting them too much or other things that might make that person uncomfortable. So we understand that mate value discrepancies might lead to different outcomes, but how do we conceptualize these differences or discrepancies within the relationship? Well, you can take a difference score. A difference score is just simply taking one partner's mate value score and subtracting it from the other. So, for example, taking self or the person who's responding to the survey's mate value and subtracting it from their partners to see where the discrepancy is. That has been the traditional approach. However, I'd like to have you folks think about something for a moment. So, in the example on the side of the slide, we have a couple different scores that are taken. So 10 minus 10 equals 0, 5 minus 5 equals 0, 2 minus 2 equals 0. So looking at this, we can imagine the scores on the left are the self scores and the scores on the right are the partner scores. Notice how two 10s make a 0, two 5s make a 0, and two 2s make a 0. That's simple math. We know that. So mathematically, these would all be considered equivalent. But psychologically, are they equivalent? In other words, are two 10s being together going to exhibit the same level of jealousy as a relationship with people who are two 2s? And this kind of translates downstream where we see when there's discrepancies like a 10 being with a 7, an 8 being with a 5, or a 6 being with a 3, these discrepancies mathematically are equivalent, but they may have the potential to show different psychological constructs at different levels of mate value for each partner. So, how do we rectify this? Response surface analyses allow two predictors to simultaneously predict an outcome and account for those varying levels of predictor X and predictor Y, seeing how does higher X lower Y or lower X higher Y at different levels where they may be congruent mathematically like before, predict something else, like a Z. So cubic response surface analysis allows for these asymmetrical or discrepant relationships. So again, the cubic response surface analysis approach is going to treat these differences differently so that now it's going to be treated as their own independent outcomes. A 10 and a 10 being together, that's a different level of congruence than a 2 and a 2. So this is why cubic response surface analyses might be a fruitful approach when talking about mate value and mate value discrepancies. Going a little further, let's talk a little bit about what a cubic response surface analysis can look like. When analyzing these, there's a few key parameters that we want to pay attention to. So for example, the line of congruence. It's when predictor 1 and predictor 2 are at a similar level. In those same examples like I provided, when one person rates themselves as a 10, whereas the other person is rated as a 10 as well. So I'm a 10, my partner's a 10. When both of those scores are congruent, we can look at the line of congruence and what it shows us. So there's the slope, which just goes to show as both are increasing and are congruent, how does it relate to our outcome? And it can also tell us if this relationship is linear or curvilinear. So for example, is it just a nice straight line where as both values increase, so too does the outcome? Or does it depend on moderate levels or extremely low or extremely high levels? That is what we can get from these different coefficients. We can also look at the line of incongruence, which essentially tells us when predictor 1 is different from predictor 2. So we can see what happens when predictor 1 is higher than predictor 2, or if predictor 1 is lower than 2. We can see what happens there. So some of the parameters that we want to focus on is it can tell us the direction of the discrepancy. So are these results stronger if it's one or the other? In other words, does it tell us that it's stronger when x is greater than y or x is lower than y? We can see if the outcome is different depending on the direction of the discrepancy. We can also see if these are linear or curvilinear associations. In sum, the purpose of this was to understand how mate value, both for oneself and their partner, affects jealousy. And we want to explore different approaches to discrepancies to get a nuanced understanding of mate value discrepancies' effects on jealousy. So we started with a hypothesis. Hypothesis 1 is that when self-mate value and partner mate value are similarly high, suspicious jealousy would decrease. Why do we believe this? Well, it's based off of the previous literature talking about greater relationship satisfaction and stability in even mate value relationships. So when that congruence is there, then we see better outcomes. So, and again, a question to think about is if people are satisfied, would there be a need to be suspicious of their partner? For our second hypothesis, we believe that suspicious jealousy would be highest when self-mate value is lower than their partners. Why did we believe this? Well, low mate value partners may be more protective of their mate, and they experience more insecurity, which might lead to more maintenance and retention behaviors. So, again, a question to think about, and what we came to our mind is who has more to worry about in the relationship when there is a discrepancy, which is why we believe that suspicious jealousy would be at its highest when they rate themselves as lower than their partner. For our final hypothesis, we wanted to look at reactive jealousy sort of more in like an exploratory manner, meaning we didn't have specific hypotheses for how reactive jealousy may be related to mate value discrepancies. This was because reactive jealousy is the reaction to a more, let's say, like unambiguous threat. And, again, the hand on the shoulder example, it's real and tangible, and so it may not be as related to discrepancies as we had previously thought. And there's also the chance that it is as healthy as it is expressed, meaning that depending on the relationship and how it's used, then it can be healthy and it can also be unhealthy. So how it was related to these discrepancies was, let's just say, like unconfirmed, or there wasn't enough there for us to hypothesize. But nonetheless, because we were running this, we wanted to see how reactive jealousy would be affected by these discrepancies. So we collected some data from two different samples. We collected one from Oakland University students. There's about 1,000 students. The sample was predominantly female, so about 86% of our respondents were women. The mean age was 20 years of age with a standard deviation of 3. The minimum age was 18 and the maximum age was 51. 87% of the population in the Oakland University sample was a dating population, whereas there were a few that were cohabitating, they were engaged, or were married. The relationship length was about a year and a half on average, with a standard deviation about 1.8 years. The minimum was 3 months and the maximum was 21 years. 90% of these relationships were heterosexual, 8% were bisexual, 1% homosexual, and 1% for other kinds of relationships. The other sample was an Israeli community sample, which we had collected 1,700 participants. This one was a little bit more evenly distributed. However, it did lean on the female side with 58% of it being women, but we had a pretty good amount of men at 42%. The mean age was 30 years of age or so, with a 12-year standard deviation. The minimum age was 18, whereas the maximum age was 80. 59% of these relationships were dating, whereas 40% were married, and 1% were including separated, divorced, or widowed relationships. The relationship length in this sample was 8 years, and with a standard deviation of about 10. The minimum length, again, was 3 months, and the maximum was 57 years. So how did we measure some of these constructs? Well, we used the mate value inventory, which was a 19-item scale, which essentially looked at items such as, does the person have an attractive body? Do they have a good sense of humor? Are they healthy? These were rated on a 7-point Likert scale, -3 being extremely low on this characteristic, and +3 being extremely high on this characteristic. So what we would do is we asked this inventory twice. The first time we asked for themselves, so rate yourself and how much you exhibit this trait. Then they were asked these again, except the directions were modified so that now it was how much does your partner exhibit this trait or characteristic. And again, the scale was on the same terms, so -3 being extremely low on this characteristic and +3 being extremely high on this characteristic. The only difference is that now they were rating their partners, so we could get their perceptions of themselves and their perceptions of their partners. Next, we measured jealousy. We used the multidimensional jealousy scale, which included two subscales, one being suspicious jealousy. It was a 16-item scale, and it looked at items such as this. I suspect that my partner may be attracted to someone else. Again, it's that ambiguous threat. Nothing is present, but they suspect it. Then there was reactive jealousy. Reactive jealousy was 8 items and included things like this. My partner is flirting with someone else. Again, it's that it's a fact and it's happening, which makes it a unambiguous and tangible threat that they may act on. Then, to look at the traditional way that mate value discrepancies have been looked at, we took self-scores on the mate value inventory and subtracted them from the partner scores. So, a positive discrepancy score would indicate that the self-score was higher than the partner. A negative score would indicate that the self-score is lower than the partner. So this is important to consider when we get into some of the traditional analyses and what those predict. It's also important to consider what the samples look like when it comes to their rates of congruence and incongruence. Congruence was measured looking at whether self-mate value was within 1 grand standard deviation of their partners, and incongruence was anything that fell outside of that 1 grand standard deviation of their partner's mate value. So anything that was within that 1 grand standard deviation, they were considered congruent, whereas if they fell out of that range, they were then incongruent. In sample 1, we found that 46% of the relationships were congruent, whereas the self was relatively related to the partner, whereas we saw 43% being incongruent, where individuals rated themselves as lower than their partner. The remaining percentage was 11%, which was individuals who rated themselves higher than their partner. Similar rates were found for the Israeli sample as well. 49% found congruent relationships between themselves and their partner, whereas 38% found incongruent responses such that they rated themselves as lower than their partners. Lastly, there was a 13% where they rated themselves as higher than their partners. So this is important for us to consider when getting into the cubic response surface analysis because these determine the different parameters when it comes to the incongruence. Let's take a look at the traditional results that we would get from traditional mate value discrepancies or discrepancy scores. We have here the self-reported mate value, the perceived mate value of the partner, and the traditional discrepancy that we took before. We also have the two subscales of the jealousy, multidimensional jealousy scale, which has suspicious and reactive jealousy. In this first column here, we can focus on specifically how self-reported mate value was associated with the different variables here. We see that self-reported mate value had a positive association with perceived mate value of the partner. In other words, if an individual rated themselves higher, they also rated their partner as higher. We see here that self-reported mate value had a negative association with suspicious jealousy. In other words, if an individual rates themselves higher on their mate value, they rated their suspicious jealousy reports as lower. They reported less suspicious jealousy. The same could not be said, though, for reactive jealousy, where it had a smaller and yet positive association. When individuals rate themselves higher on their own mate value, they reported more reactive jealousy. In the second column here, we can see how the mate value of your partner is associated with these different jealousy types. So we see again, perceived mate value of the partner had a negative association with suspicious jealousy. In other words, if you rate your partner as higher in mate value, you reported less suspicious jealousy. And again, we see the same pattern where if you rate your partner as higher, you also rate more reactive jealousy and a similar magnitude to what we saw before. Lastly, we are going to look at that traditional mate value discrepancy. As a refresher, a positive score shows that an individual rated themselves as higher compared to their partner. And what we see here with suspicious jealousy is that it is a positive association. The traditional mate value discrepancy has a positive association with suspicious jealousy. What this means is that as individuals rated themselves higher than their partner, it also corresponded with higher rates of reporting suspicious jealousy. The same kind of associations weren't seen, though, with reactive jealousy, where we didn't find any significant results, meaning that the traditional mate value discrepancy didn't seem to have any association with reactive jealousy. So, when looking at the traditional results again, this is now for the Israeli sample. The previous one was for the Oakland University sample. Now we have this. We see some of the very same trends where, again, self-reported mate value was associated with rating your partner as higher value. Higher self-reported mate value was related to lower rates of suspicious jealousy and higher rates of reactive jealousy. Same pattern over here, we see that when you rate your partner as higher mate value, you report less suspicious jealousy, but report more reactive jealousy. Lastly, for this final result, we see a very similar trend with a slight difference here. We see that as individuals rated themselves higher than their partners, they reported more suspicious jealousy. And we also saw that for some reason there's a small correlation with reactive jealousy. So as an individual rated themselves lower than their partner, then they reported higher reactive jealousy, which we didn't really anticipate this. It could be an artifact, but we're not too sure. But it's important to know. Alrighty, let's get into the main event. Let's look at these cubic response surface analyses and what they're capable of. We did this first with suspicious jealousy as our outcome in the Oakland University sample. We see that with the A1 coefficient, the line of congruent slope was significant and negative. So, for example, as the congruence rate between self and partner increased, where they go from a 1 to a 1 to a 10 to a 10, we see that suspicious jealousy decreased. The line of congruence was linear, so there weren't any curvilinear associations at work here. For the discrepancy, or the line of incongruence, we didn't see any significant direction there, and we didn't see if it was linear, curvilinear, or anything like that. Meaning we didn't see anything where the discrepancy favored either direction, that the individual was rating themselves higher or lower in respect to their partner. And we also don't see that it's predicting anything. It's not linear, curvilinear, or anything like that. What we do see here, though, with the OU sample, but for reactive jealousy, is we see a significant and positive association between partners' mate value and how it relates to reactive jealousy. In other words, the line of congruence is showing us here that as partners, both of their mate values increase and are similar rates, it is related to higher reactive jealousy on average. So higher congruence between the two relates to higher reactive jealousy. Again, we didn't see anything with the line of incongruence when it comes to the discrepancy, if it favors a specific direction, or if it's linear or curvilinear or anything like that. It didn't seem like there was anything going on with the discrepancies there. Now we get to look at the Israeli sample and how suspicious jealousy was associated with mate value discrepancies. We see that with the line of congruence, it was significant and negative. Again, that is looking at when when the partner rated themselves and their partner is having high mate value, they reported lower suspicious jealousy. What we didn't replicate here was the line of congruence's curvilinear nature in this study. What the curvilinear line here shows is that individuals with more extreme low or high congruent values of mate value, meaning that if they rate themselves and their partner as a 10, or if they rate themselves and their partner as a 1, it was actually associated with even more suspicious jealousy than had it been at those more moderate levels of like 6s and 5s or things like that. Then, when the same sample, we look at the line of incongruence and we see some results for the discrepancy. We see that the curvilinear nature of the discrepancy shows that a discrepancy on either end, when the self-mate value was higher or lower than the partner, it was associated with more suspicious jealousy. But there was a certain lean to this association, such that an individual who rated themselves as higher than their partner on their mate value perceptions, they rated more suspicious jealousy. So although both ends of the spectrum, both higher or lower self-mate value, predicted more suspicious jealousy, it seemed that this was higher on average when it was that they rated themselves as having more mate value compared to their partner. Lastly, we can look at how reactive jealousy in the Israeli sample was affected by these mate value discrepancies. We first see with the line of congruence that it was a significant and positive association, meaning when an individual rated themselves and their partner as having high mate value, it was associated with more reactive jealousy. We also see with the line of congruence that it approached significance, but it didn't seem like it was curvilinear or anything like that. So it still seems to be a linear association between the congruence of self and partner mate value and how it's associated with reactive jealousy. We also didn't see anything with the line of incongruence, so it didn't seem like the direction of the discrepancy affected reactive jealousy, nor did we see if it was linear, curvilinear, or anything like that. It seems kind of stagnant. It didn't predict anything. So that just goes to show that it didn't seem like in this sample as well that discrepancies in mate value affected reactive jealousy. Let's review some of the findings that we found across these two different samples. So what was consistent across these studies? We found that congruence, higher congruence specifically, was related to lower suspicious jealousy. And we found that to be pretty consistent across both studies. We also found that higher congruence was related to higher reactive jealousy. So when the partner perceived that themselves and their partner were of similar and high mate value, as that increased, then we also saw lower suspicious jealousy and higher reactive jealousy, meaning that they were less speculative and more reactive in instances where they might suspect jealousy or see jealousy. There was no association between these discrepancies in reactive jealousy. It seemed more like the congruence of mate value was more associated with individuals saying that they would react reactively to jealousy than they would other circumstances. So the discrepancy didn't matter as much. It seemed more to be about the congruence in the relationship. There were some inconsistent results which are kind of difficult to rectify. In sample 1, it displayed no discrepancy in how it related to suspicious jealousy. We didn't see those mate value discrepancies relate to suspicious jealousy in the American or OU sample at all. We did find that, though, for sample 2, where we saw that it displayed a discrepancy. It showed that individuals who rated themselves higher comparatively to their partner rated more suspicious jealousy, which is an interesting finding, and it also is counteractive to what we kind of had hypothesized. Let's get into some of the explanations that might rectify some of these things that we're talking about. So we did kind of confer with like previous literature. We did agree with, or our findings agreed with what people had previously found. Higher congruence matched that there is this potential effect of satisfaction when those individuals are rating themselves and their partner is high mate value, then there might be less reasons to be jealous suspiciously, and they may be more reactive or want to protect their partner. The discrepancy was only found for one study. It was only found in the Israeli sample. So is there maybe a cultural difference? Maybe it could also be a difference in the relationships. Let's keep in mind that the Israeli sample had more married couples than our OU sample did in America. It was a lot of dating. It was about 89%? 89% of those relationships were dating couples, whereas the Israeli sample, there was a large amount of them that were married. So this could also be something that is affecting the results and something to keep in mind. And the direction of the discrepancy, like I said, we had hypothesized that it would be the opposite. So we thought that when individuals rated themselves as lower, they'd be more suspiciously jealous. But it was the opposite. Why is that? It's hard for us to kind of consolidate the reason just based off of the data we have here, but it seems like maybe it is calling back to what we talked about before. Individuals who are in those relationships, they may be more speculative or questioning, like, why is this person with me? Are they seeing me for me? Things like that. We may have underestimated how much of an effect that could have on these individuals in their relationships. It should be noted that the discrepancy still did show that suspicious jealousy was higher in both discrepant situations, but the fact that it was higher amongst those who rated themselves higher compared to their partners was the surprising part. So that was an interesting finding. Alrighty, let's talk about some of the limitations and future directions that we can kind of get from this study. So first, let's talk about the discrepancies. The discrepancies we observed were not equal. Well, what does that mean? So the tendencies that we saw in our two samples in the OU and the Israeli sample, we saw that individuals rated themselves lower than their partner, more on average, compared to individuals who would rate themselves higher. This may be something about relationships where people in relationships where they rate themselves as higher may just be a little bit rarer comparatively. Individuals who rate themselves higher than their partner, they may be more likely to seek alternatives or other things along that nature. We don't know exactly, but for future studies, it is good to try and collect more individuals who might be in those relationships where they rate themselves as higher compared to their partner, just so we can get better findings and replicate these results. We might also see some issues with the self-report nature of the study. These perceptions, again, this is a survey, so these may be biased and they are likely to be affected by things like desirable responding. If an individual is met with a bunch of questions about how good they are or anything like that, they may be inflating their responses to maintain a certain self-image. They don't want to look bad, of course, and this also might reflect on how they responded to their ratings of their partner. Maybe they wanted to admit that they were better when then they maintain a certain image of their partner while they're taking the survey. If you admit a bunch of stuff where you don't like your partner, it could be damaging, so individuals may have changed some of their responses. There's also the issue of generalizability and accounting for other kinds of relationships that individuals may be in. A lot of these relationships we observed were heterosexual, and that may not track when it comes to things like homosexual relationships or even polyamorous relationships where individuals may have more than one partner. That's important to consider that just in case, because there might be other dynamics that we're not accounting for in this study. There's also other cross-cultural perspectives that we need to take account of. So in this study, we did a good job trying to get two different samples from two different backgrounds, but there is also different cultures that need to be accounted for. So this isn't a job well done. It's the start of something where we can look at different cultures and how they have different dynamics or, interplay between how mate value discrepancies are associated with jealousy and other outcomes. Speaking of other outcomes, there is a need for further modeling of these relationships. Again, what might be affecting the jealousy in the relationship on top of it? Is mate value discrepancy something that is only in effect if there's other variables at play? This is something important to consider because, we need to model this and understand how these things are related. Otherwise, we may be missing out on important information on how these are actually associated and other nuances at play. Lastly, too, because of the nature of this data, no causal associations are here. This is just looking at purely like, correlation or prediction, but there might be other things. For example, just because someone might rate themselves as higher, that may not mean that they're always going to be suspiciously jealous. It may just require certain circumstances to be at play, but this just looks at general tendencies or like perceptions. It may not be actual causal in nature. So just some things to consider. Future directions, it might be good to look at longitudinal studies to see how these constructs are constant over time. If an individual rates themselves as higher or lower, are they consistently responding and saying that they're suspicious of their partner? What does that look like in behavior context or like what they actually do? We don't have that information, but future studies can definitely develop and improve upon this area of our study. Here are my references. That is the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoy. If you have questions, you can reach out to me via comments, or will include my email somewhere in the description. Thank you so much for watching. It really means a lot just because it is an interesting presentation, and I got a lot of joy out of recording this and even working on this publication. So thank you.